My first night at this Texas cafeteria, I thought I'd seen it all. Then they handed me the rule book. Forget no running in the halls. These rules are on a whole different level, dictating everything from how you breathe to who you can even look at after dark. Get ready to have your mind blown by the strange reality of a Texas night shift. The Lone Star family cafeteria sat like a forgotten relic on Highway 287, just outside of Amarillo. During the day, it bustled with truckers, families, and locals seeking comfort food and air conditioning. But as the sun dipped below the endless Texas horizon, painting the sky in shades of burnt orange and deep purple, the place transformed into something else entirely. Something that made my skin crawl every time I pushed through those heavy glass doors at 10 p.m. I'd taken the night cook position out of desperation. 3 months unemployed, bills piling up like tumbleweeds against a fence, and my savings account looking as barren as the surrounding plains. The pay was decent for overnight work, and they'd hire me on the spot after a 5-minute interview with the day manager, Elena. She'd seemed eager to fill the position, almost relieved when I'd accepted. The night shift is different, she'd warned me, her weathered hands fidgeting with a stack of papers. You'll get used to it. I should have asked what she meant by different. I should have pressed for details when she handed me that thick manila envelope labeled Night Operations Manual, confidential, with instructions not to open it until my first shift. I should have noticed how her eyes wouldn't quite meet mine when she mentioned the previous night cook had moved on to other opportunities rather suddenly. But desperation makes you ignore red flags, doesn't it? My first night, I arrived 20 minutes early, hoping to make a good impression. The parking lot stretched empty except for 2 vehicles, a rust-eaten pickup truck and a sleek black sedan that seemed out of place among the gravel and scattered cigarette butts. The cafeteria's neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting erratic pink shadows across the asphalt. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed with an intensity that seemed almost aggressive, washing everything in harsh white light that made the pastel-colored walls look sickly. The day shift was finishing their closing procedures, moving with practiced efficiency. I watched them work, noting how they avoided looking toward the kitchen's back corners, how they spoke in hushed tones, and how they all seemed to hurry just a little more than necessary. When the last day employee clocked out at 10:15, their relief was palpable. "You must be Daniel," came a voice from behind me. I turned to find a tall, gaunt man with silver hair and eyes like chipped ice. His name tag read Thomas, night manager, and his smile never reached those cold eyes. "Yes, sir. Daniel Rodriguez. Ready to get started." Thomas nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on me with an intensity that made me want to check if my shirt was buttoned correctly. "Excellent. Let's get you oriented." He led me through the dining area, past rows of burgundy booths and formica tables that gleamed under the unforgiving lights. The place smelled of industrial cleaner and something else, something sweet and cloying that seemed to hover just beneath the surface of recognition. As we walked, I noticed details I'd missed during my interview. The way certain floor tiles were slightly darker than others, forming what almost looked like a pattern. The faded water stains on the ceiling that resembled reaching fingers. The windows that had been painted black on the inside, blocking any view of the parking lot. "The kitchen is your domain," Thomas said, pushing through the swinging doors into the prep area. "During night hours, you're responsible for basic food prep for the morning shift, deep cleaning, and inventory management." Simple enough. The kitchen was larger than it appeared from the dining room, stretching back into shadows that the overhead lights couldn't quite penetrate. Stainless steel surfaces reflected distorted images, and the walk-in freezer hummed with a sound like distant whispers. Everything looked normal enough. Industrial-grade equipment, health department certificates on the walls, the usual array of pots, pans, and utensils hanging from metal racks. But something felt wrong. The air was too still, too heavy. And why did every metal surface look like it had been recently polished to a mirror shine? Now, Thomas said, producing the manila envelope from his jacket pocket, let's discuss the rules. He opened it with the solemnity of someone unveiling a sacred text. Inside were several typewritten pages, the kind produced by an old typewriter with keys that struck unevenly. The paper felt strange beneath my fingers, thicker than normal, with a texture that reminded me uncomfortably of skin. Rule number 1. Thomas began, his voice taking on a ritualistic cadence. Under no circumstances are you to handle fresh produce between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. All fruits and vegetables are to remain locked in the produce cooler during night operations. I blinked. But what if I need them for prep work? Aren't I supposed to be getting things ready for the morning shift? Thomas's smile grew wider, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp. Rule number 1 exists for your safety, Daniel. The produce changes after dark. It becomes unpredictable, volatile even. We've had incidents. Nothing you need to worry about, as long as you follow the rules. He flipped to the next page. Rule number 2. All cleaning must be performed using only the blue-labeled solutions, and only after 2 a.m. The green and red solutions are strictly forbidden during night hours. Never mix chemicals. Never deviate from the specified cleaning agents. I nodded, though the arbitrary nature of the time restriction puzzled me. And the reason for waiting until 2 a.m. The facility needs time to adjust to the night shift environment. Chemical reactions can be unpredictable during the transition period. His explanation sounded like bureaucratic nonsense, but I'd worked enough jobs to know when not to push for clarity. Sometimes management implemented policies for reasons they couldn't or wouldn't share with regular employees. Rule number 3, Thomas continued, is perhaps the most important. During inventory counts, you must not vocalize numbers aloud. All counting must be done silently, using only the hand signals detailed on page 4. This one made me laugh, though Thomas's expression quickly wiped the smile from my face. You're serious? Deadly serious, Daniel. Sound carries differently at night in this building. Certain frequencies can cause disturbances. We use the silent counting system to prevent acoustic anomalies. I flipped to page 4 and found a detailed chart showing hand positions for numbers 1 through 100. It looked like some bizarre form of sign language, with complex finger configurations that would take weeks to memorize. There are 17 more rules, Thomas said, his voice now barely above a whisper. Each one exists for a specific reason, learned through experience. Some of that experience was costly. The way he said costly made my mouth go dry. What kind of costs are we talking about? But Thomas was already moving toward the kitchen exit, the rule book clutched against his chest like armor. I'll be in the office if you need anything. Remember, Daniel, the rules aren't suggestions. They're survival instructions. Follow them exactly, and you'll have a long, profitable career here. Deviate from them. He let the sentence hang in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Alone in the kitchen, I read through the remaining rules with growing unease. Rule 7 prohibited opening the freezer door more than twice per hour. Rule 11 forbade looking directly into any reflective surface for more than 3 seconds at a time. Rule 15 stated that if I heard knocking from inside the walls, I was to immediately stop what I was doing and stand perfectly still until the sound ceased. By the time I reached Rule 20, my hand was shaking. The final rule was written in red ink, unlike all the others. If you see the previous cook, do not acknowledge him. Do not speak to him. Do not look directly at him. He is no longer employed here. The previous cook, not a previous cook, but the previous cook capitalized like a title. And what did it mean that he was no longer employed here? Why would I see him if he didn't work here anymore? I looked around the pristine kitchen with new eyes, noting details I'd missed before. Scratch marks on the freezer door that looked almost like claw marks. A section of wall tiles that were slightly different in color, as if they'd been recently replaced. A faint outline on the floor near the prep station that could have been left by bleach or something else entirely. The clock on the wall read 11:47 p.m. I had 8 hours and 13 minutes left on my first shift, and already I was beginning to understand why the day manager had been so eager to hire me. Outside, the Texas wind began to howl, rattling the building's bones and making the fluorescent lights flicker in a rhythm that almost seemed intentional. In that stuttering illumination, shadows danced at the edges of my vision, and I could swear I heard footsteps in the dining room, even though I knew Thomas was locked away in his office. I picked up my prep knife with trembling fingers and tried to focus on the simple task of dicing onions for the morning shift. But as the blade caught the light, reflecting my distorted face back at me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice that sounded disturbingly like my own whispered, "Welcome to the night shift, Daniel. Try not to end up like the previous cook." The onion made my eyes water, or at least that's what I told myself as tears began to stream down my cheeks. Because admitting I was crying from fear would mean acknowledging that I was trapped in something far worse than just another dead-end job. But the bills wouldn't pay themselves, and winter was coming to the Texas plains. I had no choice but to stay, to learn the rules, and to hope that whatever had happened to the previous cook wouldn't happen to me. After all, how hard could it be to follow 20 simple rules? The first week passed in a blur of careful rule following and mounting dread. Each night, I entered the Lone Star family cafeteria with a manila envelope clutched in my sweaty palm, reviewing the 20 rules like prayers before walking into a haunted church. But it was the small things, the details Thomas hadn't mentioned, that kept me awake during my daylight sleeping hours. Like how the produce cooler's lock wasn't just a standard commercial lock. It was a heavy-duty deadbolt with what looked like religious symbols carved into the metal. Or how the blue cleaning solutions came in unmarked bottles that Thomas refilled from a locked cabinet in his office, never allowing me to see the original containers. And then there was the hand signal system for counting inventory. Movements so specific and intricate that they resembled some form of ritual communication. By my 8th night, I'd memorized most of the rules and settled into an uneasy routine. I arrived at 10 p.m., received my nightly briefing from Thomas, and began my work with mechanical precision. Prep work using only non-fresh ingredients, deep cleaning with blue solutions after 2 a.m., and inventory counts performed in absolute silence with those strange hand gestures. But tonight felt different from the moment I walked through the front door. The air was thick with tension, electric like the moments before a thunderstorm. Thomas was waiting for me by the coffee station, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. His silver hair was mussed, and there was something that looked suspiciously like dirt under his fingernails. "Daniel," he said, his voice carrying a tremor I'd never heard before. "We need to discuss some additional protocols." Additional protocols. My stomach dropped. The 20 rules weren't enough. He led me to a corner booth in the dining area, the kind of spot where secrets get shared and confessions are made. The fluorescent light above us flickered sporadically, casting shifting shadows across his weathered face. "You've been doing well," Thomas began, his ice-chip eyes scanning the empty restaurant, "following the rules precisely, maintaining discipline. But there are circumstances that require advanced guidance." "What kind of circumstances?" Thomas reached into his jacket and produced a smaller envelope, this one sealed with what appeared to be black wax. "These are the contingency protocols, rules 21 through 35. Most night cooks never need to know them, but recent developments suggest you should be prepared." My hand shook as I broke the wax seal. The paper inside was different from the original rules. Older, yellowed with age, and written in various handwriting styles, as if different people had added to it over time. "Rule 21, I read aloud, then stopped when Thomas held up a sharp finger. "Not here," he hissed, glancing toward the kitchen doors. "Some things shouldn't be spoken in the open." Read them privately in the storage room. And Daniel, his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. If you encounter a situation requiring these protocols, remember that hesitation kills. Act immediately, without question, without doubt. He stood to leave, then paused. One more thing. The previous cook, he's been more active lately. If you see him, follow Rule 20 exactly. Your life depends on it. Alone in the dining area, I stared at the envelope in my hands. The wax seal bore a symbol I didn't recognize, something that looked like a twisted tree with roots and branches that seemed to move in my peripheral vision. When I looked directly at it, it was just a simple design, but the moment my gaze shifted, it appeared to writhe and pulse. I made my way to the storage room, a cramped space behind the kitchen filled with industrial-sized cans and boxes of dry goods. The single bulb cast harsh shadows between the metal shelving units, creating a maze of light and darkness that made me feel claustrophobic. With trembling fingers, I unfolded the additional rules. Rule 21 was written in faded blue ink. If the temperature in the walk-in cooler drops below 28 degrees Fahrenheit, evacuate the kitchen immediately. Do not retrieve personal items. Do not turn off equipment. Run. Rule 22. In different handwriting. Should you hear children's laughter coming from the dining area during your shift, ignore it completely. Children do not visit the cafeteria during night operations. What sounds like children is not children. Rule 23 made my blood run cold. If you see someone who looks exactly like you working in the kitchen, do not approach. Do not speak to them. Continue your duties as if they are not there. This phenomenon typically lasts 47 minutes. I had to stop reading and take several deep breaths. The storage room suddenly felt too small, too warm, too full of shadows that seemed to reach toward me with grasping fingers. But I forced myself to continue. Rule 24. The grease trap and floor drain C. 7 must never be cleaned during night hours. If you hear gurgling sounds from this drain, sprinkle salt in a circle around it and wait for the sounds to stop. Rule 25. Mirrors reflect more than your image after midnight. Look only long enough to complete necessary tasks. If your reflection appears to be moving independently, close your eyes and count to 50 before looking again. Each rule was more disturbing than the last, painting a picture of a workplace where reality itself seemed unstable. Rule 30 described what to do if the cash register in the dining room began ringing by itself. Rule 32 provided instructions for dealing with customers who appeared after closing time, but cast no reflection in the windows. The final rule, number 35, was written in what looked suspiciously like dried blood. If Thomas does not arrive for his shift, leave immediately. Do not wait for a replacement. Do not attempt to contact management. Do not return for 72 hours. Some nights, you work alone. Some nights, you don't work at all. I folded the papers with numb fingers and slipped them into my pocket. The original 20 rules had seemed bizarre, but manageable. Weird workplace policies implemented by paranoid management. These additional 15 rules suggested something far more sinister. They read like instructions for surviving supernatural encounters, not operating a small-town cafeteria. Back in the kitchen, I tried to focus on my prep work, but every shadow seemed to hide threats. Every sound carried ominous implications. The walk-in cooler's compressor kicked on with a shudder that made me check the temperature gauge, 34 degrees, safely above the 28-degree threshold mentioned in Rule 21. At exactly 2 a.m., I began the cleaning routine with the blue label solutions. The chemicals had a sharp, medicinal smell that burned my nostrils and made my eyes water. As I worked, I noticed something I'd missed before. The blue solutions didn't just clean surfaces, they seemed to make them shine with an unnatural brightness, as if the metal itself was emitting light. I was wiping down the prep counter when I heard it, a soft giggling coming from the dining area. Children's laughter, high-pitched and innocent, drifting through the swinging doors like smoke. Rule 22 echoed in my mind. Should you hear children's laughter coming from the dining area during your shift, ignore it completely. I forced myself to continue cleaning, but the laughter grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like several children, maybe 5 or 6, playing some kind of game. Hide and seek, perhaps, or tag. Normal, everyday sounds that would have been comforting during daylight hours, but felt deeply wrong at 2:17 a.m. in an empty cafeteria. The laughter moved closer to the kitchen doors, and I could hear small feet running across the dining room floor. My hands gripped the cleaning rags so tightly my knuckles went white, and I had to remind myself to breathe. Rule 22. Ignore it completely. Whatever was making those sounds was not children. But what was it? The running footsteps stopped directly outside the kitchen doors. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then, slowly, one of the doors began to creak open. I didn't look. I couldn't look. Instead, I focused on wiping the same section of counter over and over, scrubbing with mechanical intensity while sweat poured down my face. The door opened wider, and I felt something small brush past my leg. The sensation of a child running by in a hurry. More footsteps, more giggling, and the unmistakable sound of small hands touching the stainless steel surfaces I just cleaned. But I kept my eyes fixed on the counter, following the rule with desperate precision. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the sounds faded. The kitchen doors swung shut with their familiar squeak, and I was alone again with the hum of refrigeration units and the harsh fluorescent lighting. I finished the cleaning in record time, my hands shaking as I put away the blue label bottles. Whatever those things had been, they'd left no trace of their presence. The surfaces I'd heard them touching showed no fingerprints, no evidence that anything had been there at all. The inventory count was next, and I dreaded it more than anything else on my nightly routine. Not because of the hand signals. I mastered those by now, but because it required me to move through every section of the kitchen, including the dark corners where shadows seemed to gather with unnatural density. I started with the dry goods storage, counting cans of tomatoes and boxes of pasta using the intricate finger movements detailed in the manual. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the building's settling groans and the distant hum of the dining room's refrigerated display cases. It was while counting flour sacks that I first noticed the smell. Something sweet and rotten, like fruit left to decay in the sun. It was faint at first, barely noticeable beneath the usual kitchen odors of cleaning chemicals and cooking oil. But as I moved deeper into the storage area, it grew stronger. The smell was coming from the direction of the produce cooler. I approached the heavy door with growing unease, noting that the deadbolt lock with its carved symbols was still securely fastened. But the smell was definitely emanating from behind that door, seeping through the sealed edges like poison gas. Rule number 1 echoed in my memory. Under no circumstances are you to handle fresh produce between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. All fruits and vegetables are to remain locked in the produce cooler during night operations. But what if something was wrong in there? What if the refrigeration had failed and thousands of dollars worth of produce was rotting? Surely Thomas would want to know about equipment failure, wouldn't he? I pressed my ear against the cold metal door, listening for any sounds from within. What I heard made my blood freeze in my veins. Scratching, soft at first, then more insistent, like fingernails dragging across metal. And underneath that sound, something that might have been whispering, voices so quiet I couldn't make out words, but unmistakably human in cadence and rhythm. The produce was locked away for my safety, Thomas had said. It became unpredictable after dark, volatile. Now, standing in front of that sealed door with the stench of decay filling my nostrils and the sound of impossible voices drifting from within, I began to understand what he'd meant. The produce wasn't just produce after dark. It was something else entirely. Something that whispered and scratched and rotted and grew in the darkness, something that had to be kept locked away from the world of the living. And I was standing 3 feet away from it with nothing but a deadbolt and my own terrified obedience to the rules keeping me safe. I backed away from the door, my legs weak with fear, and finished the inventory count in record time. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Every sound carried the promise of something terrible lurking just beyond perception. As dawn approached and the end of my shift drew near, I realized that the previous cook hadn't quit or found better opportunities. He'd probably broken one of the rules, ignored the protocols that kept the night shift employees safe from whatever haunted the Lone Star family cafeteria after dark. And now I was next in line, walking the same narrow path between survival and horror, hoping that my fear and careful obedience would be enough to keep me from joining him in whatever fate awaited those who learned the truth about the night shift too late. The morning manager would arrive soon, and with her would come blessed daylight and normal people with normal problems. But I would return tomorrow night and the night after that because the alternatives, unemployment, eviction, starvation, seemed somehow less terrifying than admitting I was trapped in a job that might literally cost me my life. After all, I was already 8 shifts in, and I was still alive. How much worse could it get? 2 weeks into my employment at the Lone Star family cafeteria, I developed the kind of hypervigilance usually reserved for combat veterans and parole officers. Every sound was cataloged and analyzed. Every shadow examined for signs of movement. Every smell dissected for hints of the supernatural decay that seemed to permeate the building after dark. I'd also started keeping a journal, documenting the strange occurrences that the rules didn't quite prepare me for. The way certain floor tiles grew warm to the touch around 3 a.m. How the radio in the kitchen occasionally picked up broadcasts in languages that didn't sound quite human. The morning when I'd found my prep knives arranged in a perfect circle on the cutting board, though I distinctly remembered putting them away in the designated drawer. But it was the growing collection of questions that kept me awake during my daylight hours. Why did the produce become volatile after dark? What was the significance of 2 a.m. for cleaning procedures? And most importantly, what had happened to the previous cook that made Rule 20 so desperately important? My chance for answers came on a Thursday night in my 3rd week, when I arrived to find Thomas in the parking lot, leaning against his black sedan and smoking a cigarette with the intensity of a man trying to calm his nerves. "Evening, Daniel," he said, his voice lacking its usual authoritative edge. "Mind if we take a walk before you start your shift?" The request was so unusual that I almost asked if everything was all right. But Thomas's hollow expression and the way his hand shook as he flicked ash onto the gravel told me that everything was decidedly not all right. We walked to the edge of the parking lot, where the asphalt gave way to empty Texas plains that stretched endlessly under the star-filled sky. The wind carried the scent of sage and something else, something that reminded me of the smell that leaked from the produce cooler. "You've been doing good work," Thomas said, taking a long drag from his cigarette. "Following the rules, keeping your head down, staying safe. But I can see it in your eyes. The questions are eating at you." I nodded, not trusting my voice. 23 years I've been managing night operations here," he continued, staring out at the darkness beyond the highway. 23 years of rules and protocols and careful maintenance of something that should never have been allowed to take root in the first place. "What kind of something?" Thomas dropped his cigarette and ground it under his heel with more force than necessary. "This land has a history, Daniel. The kind of history that gets buried in old records and forgotten by everyone except the people unlucky enough to have to deal with the consequences." He pulled out his phone and showed me a grainy photograph of a newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Tragic fire claims entire family at Lone Star Homestead, 1953. The Garrison family," Thomas said. 5 generations of them lived on this exact spot for over a century. Farming, raising cattle, living off the land the way people did back then. But in 1953, something went wrong. I leaned closer to read the article text, though the phone screen made it difficult to make out details. House fires started in the root cellar where they store their produce for the winter, Thomas continued. Official report blamed faulty wiring, but the survivors, and there were precious few, told a different story. They said the vegetables had started talking to them, whispering at night, moving on their own, growing in unnatural ways. The produce, I whispered, understanding beginning to dawn. The family patriarch, Old Man Garrison, had been experimenting with some kind of folk magic. Fertility rituals, crop blessings, the kind of things desperate farmers turn to when conventional methods fail. But he went too far, tapped into something that should have been left alone. The land itself became infected. Thomas started walking back toward the cafeteria, and I followed, my mind racing with implications. When they built this place in 1987, the construction crew found things buried in the foundation area. Bones that weren't quite animal, weren't quite human. Plant matter that had been preserved in ways that defied explanation. The developers wanted to pull out, but the profit margins were too good to ignore. So they built anyway. And for the first few years, everything was normal. Day shifts ran smoothly. Customers were happy. Profits were solid. But then the night managers started reporting problems. Equipment failures, strange sounds, employees quitting without notice. We'd reached the front entrance, but Thomas made no move to go inside. Instead, he lit another cigarette, his hand steadier now that he'd begun sharing the burden of knowledge. The problems escalated until they brought in consultants. Not business consultants, the other kind. People who understood what we were dealing with. They developed the protocols, the rules that keep the influence manageable. The rules aren't just weird workplace policies, I said. They're containment procedures. Exactly. The produce cooler isn't just refrigeration. It's a containment unit. The lock has symbols blessed by 3 different religious traditions, and the door is lined with materials that suppress supernatural activity. The blue cleaning solutions contain compounds that disrupt psychic residue. The silent inventory counting prevents vocal frequencies from triggering responses from whatever's listening in the walls. I thought about the children's laughter, the scratching from the produce cooler, the warm floor tiles, and impossible radio broadcasts. And the previous cook, Thomas's expression grew darker. His name was Miguel Santos. Good man, reliable worker, followed the rules for 8 months without incident. Then one night, he decided the produce rule was just management paranoia. Figured he'd take a quick look inside the cooler, maybe grab some lettuce for a sandwich. What happened? We found him 3 days later, locked inside the cooler. Officially, it was hypothermia, but Thomas paused, taking a shaky breath. The produce had grown around him, Daniel. Vines and roots that don't exist in nature, wrapping around his body like he was being absorbed into something larger. And his face looked like he'd seen something that broke his mind. I felt sick, imagining Miguel's final moments trapped in that supernatural garden of horror. But here's the thing that really keeps me awake at night, Thomas continued. Sometimes the rules aren't enough. Sometimes the influence breaks through despite our best efforts. When that happens, we implement emergency protocols, the contingency rules. And lately, Daniel, we've been having more breakthrough events. Whatever's sleeping under this place is getting stronger, more active. The barriers we've maintained for decades are starting to weaken, as if summoned by his words. The cafeteria's lights flickered in a pattern that looked almost like Morse code. In the brief moments of darkness, I could swear I saw shapes moving behind the painted black windows. So why tell me all this? I asked. Why not just let me follow the rules blindly? Thomas's ice-chip eyes met mine with an intensity that made me want to look away. Because I'm getting old, Daniel. 67 years old. And this job has aged me in ways that aren't natural. The night shift needs someone who understands the full scope of what we're dealing with. Someone who can make the hard choices when the rules aren't enough. You're talking about replacing yourself. I'm talking about training a successor. Someone who can take over night operations when I can't do it anymore. The pay increase would be substantial, nearly triple your current salary. But the responsibilities. He gestured toward the building with its flickering lights and painted windows. The responsibilities are enormous. The offer hung in the air between us like smoke from a cigarette. Triple salary would solve all my financial problems, set me up for life if I could stand the work. But it would also mean accepting a role as guardian of something that wanted nothing more than to break free and spread its influence beyond this isolated patch of Texas highway. I need time to think about it, I said finally. Thomas nodded. Of course, but don't take too long. Recent events suggest we're approaching some kind of crisis point. The barriers are failing, the rules are becoming less effective, and whatever's been contained here for 7 decades is getting ready to make its move. We went inside, and Thomas retreated his office while I began my shift with a new understanding of why every rule existed. The produce cooler wasn't just locked to keep me out. It was locked to keep something in. The blue cleaning solutions weren't just industrial-grade cleansers. They were weapons in an ongoing war against supernatural contamination. The hand signals for inventory counting weren't bureaucratic nonsense. They were protective mantras designed to shield my mind from influences that fed on human vocal frequencies. But knowledge, I was discovering, was both a blessing and a curse. Now, when I heard scratching from inside the produce cooler, I knew exactly what was making those sounds. When the children's laughter drifted from the dining room, I understood that I was hearing echoes of voices from another reality entirely. When my reflection in the steel surfaces seemed to move independently, I recognized it as a sign that the barriers between worlds were thinning. And when, at 4:33 a.m., I caught a glimpse of a figure in a cook's apron standing in the corner of the kitchen, a figure with Miguel Santos's face and eyes that held the hollow terror of someone who'd seen too much, I understood that some rules existed not to protect the living from the dead, but to protect the dead from something infinitely worse. The previous cook was still here, trapped between worlds, serving as a warning to anyone foolish enough to think the rules were merely suggestions. As my shift ended, and the morning manager arrived with her cheerful complaints about the coffee machine and her gossip about the day's shift drama, I realized I had a choice to make. I could quit, walk away from the Lone Star family cafeteria and its supernatural infestation, find some other way to pay my bills and survive in the world. Or I could accept Thomas's offer, take on the mantle of night manager, and spend my remaining years standing guard against something that grew stronger every night. The smart choice was obvious. The safe choice was clear. But as I drove home through the Texas dawn, I couldn't stop thinking about Miguel Santos and the terror in his hollow eyes. And I knew that walking away would mean abandoning him to an eternity of serving as a warning that nobody might ever heed. Some jobs, I was learning, weren't just about earning money. Sometimes they were about keeping the rest of the world safe from things that should never see the light of day, even if it cost you everything to do it. The decision came to me on a Tuesday night during my 4th week, when I walked into the cafeteria to find Thomas unconscious on the office floor. I'd arrived at my usual time, 9:50 p.m., expecting the routine handoff and briefing that had become as familiar as breathing. But the dining room lights were flickering in rapid, chaotic patterns, and the building's electrical hum had taken on a harmonious quality that sounded almost like singing. "Thomas," I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the empty space. No response. I found him behind his desk, collapsed in his chair with his head thrown back and his eyes rolled up to show only whites. His breathing was shallow but steady, and his skin felt cold to the touch despite the building's oppressive warmth. On the desk in front of him lay an open manila envelope I'd never seen before, its contents scattered across the wooden surface. The papers were covered in handwritten notes, some in Thomas's precise script, others in different hands entirely. At the top of the first page, written in red ink that looked suspiciously fresh, were the words, Emergency Protocols. Level 3 Containment Breach. Rule 35 echoed in my memory. If Thomas does not arrive for his shift, leave immediately. But Thomas had arrived. He was here, unconscious but present. The rule didn't account for this scenario, which meant I was operating without guidance in a situation that was clearly escalating beyond normal parameters. I gathered the scattered papers, noting dates that went back decades. Incident reports, containment failures, casualty assessments. The picture they painted was of an ongoing war between the cafeteria's management and whatever presence had infected the land beneath it. A war that was slowly being lost. Entry dated March 15th, 2019. I read aloud from one report. Produced containment breach lasted 4 hours before restoration. 2 night staff members affected. Memory modification required. Cover story, food poisoning outbreak. Memory modification. They'd been dealing with this supernatural infestation for so long that they had protocols for erasing witnesses' minds. Another entry from just 6 months ago. Increasing signs of systemic breakdown. Barriers weakening faster than repair crews can reinforce them. Recommend evacuation and permanent closure within 18 months. The most recent entry was dated yesterday. Signs point to imminent total containment failure. Level 3 protocols may be insufficient, considering Level 4 emergency measures. I didn't want to know what Level 4 emergency measures entailed. Thomas stirred, his eyes fluttering open with the disorientation of someone emerging from anesthesia. When his gaze focused on me, I saw something I'd never seen before in those ice-chip eyes. Relief. Daniel, he whispered, his voice raw. Thank God you're here. How long was I out? I just found you. What happened? He struggled to sit up, wincing as if movement caused him physical pain. Level 3 breach. Started around 8 p.m. The presence, it's stronger tonight than I've ever felt it. Knocked me unconscious when I tried to implement standard containment measures. As if summoned by his words, the building shuddered around us. Not the settling groans of an old structure, but something that felt organic, like the breathing of an enormous creature. The lights flickered in sequence, creating patterns of illumination that seemed almost intentional. We need to evacuate, Thomas said, reaching for his phone. Call the emergency response team. Implement Level 4 protocols. No. The word came out of my mouth before I consciously made the decision. Tell me what I need to do to contain it. Thomas stared at me as if I'd volunteered for a suicide mission, which I was beginning to realize might be exactly what I'd done. Daniel, you don't understand the scope of what we're dealing with. Level 3 breaches have killed experienced night managers. This isn't a job for someone with 4 weeks of experience. But even as he protested, I could see him calculating odds, weighing options. The emergency response team was hours away. Level 4 protocols probably involved demolition and cover-ups that would destroy whatever life I'd built in this small Texas town. And underneath all his rational arguments, I could see the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, there was another way. Teach me, I said. Walk me through the Level 3 protocols. If it doesn't work, then we call for backup. Thomas studied my face for a long moment, then nodded grimly. The advanced containment equipment is in the basement storage area. But Daniel, you need to understand, if this goes wrong, if the breach spreads beyond the building perimeter, we're not just talking about one haunted cafeteria. We're talking about supernatural contamination that could affect the entire region. The basement was accessible through a concealed door behind the main kitchen's freezer unit. Thomas led me down a narrow staircase that looked far older than the rest of the building, its stone walls carved with the same symbols that decorated the produce cooler's lock. The air grew colder with each step, and by the time we reached the bottom, Our breath was visible in the dim light of industrial work lamps. The basement was larger than the entire main floor, stretching out in multiple directions with corridors that disappeared into darkness. The walls were lined with metal shelving units holding equipment I didn't recognize, devices that looked like a cross between scientific instruments and religious artifacts. "Welcome to the real nerve center," Thomas said, his voice echoing off stone walls. "Everything upstairs is just window dressing. This is where the actual work gets done." He showed me monitors displaying readings from sensors placed throughout the building. Most showed green lights, but several were flashing red, and one in particular, labeled Produce Containment Unit, was strobing an angry crimson. "Temperature inside the produce cooler has dropped to -40 degrees," Thomas explained, pointing to digital readouts that made no sense. "That's not mechanical failure. That's supernatural refrigeration. Whatever's in there is drawing thermal energy directly from the environment. And that's bad because extreme temperature differential creates dimensional weak points. The entity is trying to freeze a hole between realities, create a permanent gateway it can use to expand its influence." He handed me a device that looked like a combination Geiger counter and television remote. "This measures psychic radiation levels. Normal reading is between 1 and 5. Right now, we're seeing spikes of 47. The implications were staggering. I was standing in the basement of a small-town cafeteria, learning to operate equipment designed to measure and contain forces that most people would dismiss as impossible. "The Level 3 protocol involves 3 stages," Thomas continued, moving to a wall-mounted control panel that looked like something from a nuclear power plant. "First, we flood the produce containment unit with blessed salt water to disrupt the entity's connection to organic matter. Second, we activate the building's electromagnetic field generators to create a barrier grid. Third, we initiate a psychic feedback pulse to drive the presence back into dormancy. And if that doesn't work," Thomas's expression was grim. "Level 4 protocols involve controlled demolition and a cover story about gas line explosions." The building shuddered again, more violently this time, and several of the monitors switched from red to black entirely. Through the stone walls, I could hear sounds that definitely weren't coming from normal building systems. A rhythmic thumping like a massive heartbeat, and underneath that, the whispered voices I'd learned to associate with breakthrough events. "It's accelerating," Thomas said, his fingers flying over the control panel. "We need to start the sequence now." The first stage went smoothly. Pipes built into the basement walls carried the blessed salt water mixture to the produce containment unit upstairs, and we watched on monitors as the temperature readings began to stabilize. The crimson strobing slowed to a steady red glow. But when Thomas activated the electromagnetic field generators for Stage 2, something went wrong. Instead of the low hum we'd expected, the generators produced a sound like screaming metal, and sparks began shooting from control panels throughout the basement. The monitors flickered and died one by one, leaving us in near darkness with only the emergency lighting to see by. "System overload," Thomas shouted over the mechanical shrieking. "The entity is drawing too much power, feeding off the electromagnetic energy instead of being contained by it." Through the stone ceiling, we could hear chaos erupting in the main building, glass breaking, metal tearing, and underneath it all, a sound that was definitely organic. Something large moving through spaces too small to contain it. "Level 4, I asked. Thomas was already reaching for the emergency phone when the basement lights went out entirely. In the absolute darkness that followed, I heard Thomas's sharp intake of breath, then nothing. No breathing, no movement, no indication that he was still conscious or even still alive. I fumbled for the psychic radiation detector he'd given me, using its faint display glow to navigate through the basement. The readings had gone completely off scale, showing numbers that flickered too rapidly to read, but were clearly far beyond anything the device was designed to measure. That's when I heard the footsteps on the basement stairs. Slow, deliberate, descending with the patience of something that had waited decades for this moment. In the faint glow of the radiation detector, I could see a figure taking shape at the bottom of the stairs. A figure wearing a cook's apron and bearing the hollow, terrified expression of Miguel Santos. But this wasn't a glimpse of the previous cook I'd seen before. This was something more substantial, more present. Miguel stepped into the basement with solid footfalls, his dead eyes reflecting the detector's light like mirrors. "The rules," he said, his voice carrying the weight of eternity. "The rules are breaking down, Daniel. Soon, there won't be any rules at all." Behind him, more figures began descending the stairs. Other night shift workers, other managers, other people who'd try to contain what couldn't be contained and paid the ultimate price for their failure. "But there's still time," Miguel continued, moving closer. "Still time to choose. Join us willingly, and the transition will be easier. Fight it, and become like Thomas, conscious but powerless, aware but unable to act." I looked toward where Thomas had collapsed, and in the detector's faint light, I could see him standing perfectly still, his eyes open but vacant, his mouth moving soundlessly as if he was trying to speak but couldn't form words. "What do you want?" I asked Miguel's corpse. "Freedom," the previous cook replied. "After 70 years of containment, we want to see the sun again, to feel the wind, to spread beyond this place and show the world what we've learned about the spaces between life and death." The offer was clear. Join them voluntarily and maintain some semblance of consciousness, or resist and become a puppet like Thomas, aware but unable to control my own actions. But there was a third option, one that Miguel and his ghostly companions hadn't considered. I still had the psychic feedback device. Thomas had said it was stage 3 of the level 3 protocol, designed to drive the presence back into dormancy. But looking at the radiation detector's impossible readings, I realized the entity was far too strong for standard containment measures. Instead of trying to push it back into dormancy, what if I pushed it forward? What if instead of containing the breach, I completed it? A total containment failure might destroy the building, might even contaminate the surrounding area, but it would also dissipate the concentrated supernatural energy that had been building for 7 decades. Like lancing a wound to drain infection. Sometimes the only way to heal is to let the poison out. "Sorry, Miguel," I whispered, reaching for the feedback device. The previous cook's dead eyes widened with understanding a split second before I activated the pulse. What happened next was like standing inside a lightning bolt while being hit by a freight train. The psychic feedback, amplified by 70 years of accumulated supernatural energy, didn't just drive the entity back. It shattered every barrier between dimensions, collapsed every containment protocol, and released decades of suppressed otherworldly pressure in a single, catastrophic explosion of pure paranormal force. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the sound of the building above us tearing itself apart, and Miguel Santos screaming, not in terror, but in joy as he and his fellow prisoners were finally, truly free. When I woke up 18 hours later in an Amarillo hospital, the Lone Star family cafeteria was a pile of rubble beside Highway 287, and the official explanation was a gas line explosion that had somehow left no trace of gas or fire damage. But I knew the truth, and sometimes, late at night, I could swear I heard Miguel's voice on the wind, thanking me for the gift of true death. Some prisons, I'd learned, are meant to be broken, even if it destroys everything else in the process. 6 months after the gas line explosion that leveled the Lone Star family cafeteria, I was working as a short-order cook at a truck stop diner outside of Lubbock, trying to convince myself that the nightmares would eventually fade and that the phantom smell of rotting produce was just my imagination playing tricks. But you can't unknow what I knew. You can't unsee what I'd seen. The official story held up under scrutiny Because the people who'd crafted it had been perfecting cover stories for decades. Gas leak, tragic accident, insurance payout, move along, nothing to see here. The land where the cafeteria had stood was purchased by a development company that seemed to exist only on paper, and within 2 months it had been covered with a thick layer of concrete and converted into a truck parking area. Thomas had survived, though survive might not be the right word. He'd been found his car in the parking lot with no memory of the past 5 years, and a medical condition that doctors couldn't explain, a form of selective amnesia that had erased everything related to his time managing night operations. He'd been relocated to a retirement community in Florida, where he spent his days playing checkers and complaining about the quality of the cafeteria food. The official casualty count was 0, which was technically accurate if you didn't count the 23 people who died over the years, and whose remains had been absorbed into whatever supernatural ecosystem had existed beneath the building. The explosion had scattered those remains across 3 counties, giving them the burial they'd been denied for decades. But the real question, the one that kept me awake during my new day shift hours, was whether I'd actually solved the problem or simply relocated it. Because I'd started noticing things, little things at first. Customers at the truck stop diner who ordered food and then forgot they'd ordered it. Truckers who claimed they'd been having dreams about vegetables growing in unnatural configurations. A delivery driver who swore he'd seen Miguel Santos pumping gas at the station next door. Though impressed for details, he couldn't explain how he knew the man's name. The supernatural energy that had been contained beneath the cafeteria for 70 years hadn't just dissipated when I triggered the feedback pulse. It had been released into the environment, spreading outward like ripples on a pond, carrying fragments of the entity's influence to dozens of locations across the Texas Panhandle. I'd solved the immediate problem by destroying the concentrated source, but in doing so, I'd created dozens of smaller problems scattered across hundreds of square miles. Instead of one haunted cafeteria, there were now haunted gas stations, haunted motels, haunted diners, and haunted truck stops throughout the region. The call started coming in February. Daniel, this is Rebecca Martinez from the Highway 83 Travel Plaza. I got your number from... Well, that doesn't matter. What matters is that we're having some unusual problems during our night shift, and someone told me you might have experience with this kind of thing. She was the first, but not the last. Word spreads quickly in small-town Texas, especially when that word involves strange occurrences and someone who might know how to handle them. By March, I was getting 3 or 4 calls a week from business owners, night shift managers, and security guards who were dealing with situations that defied rational explanation. A motel where guests in room 237 reported conversations with previous occupants who died years earlier. A gas station where the pumps occasionally dispensed something that wasn't gasoline, but looked like black, viscous plant matter. A restaurant where the walk-in freezer had developed its own microclimate, complete with weather patterns that included snow and lightning. Each location had been affected differently, as if the fragments of the original entity were adapting to their new environments and manifesting in ways that reflected the specific nature of their surroundings. But they all shared certain characteristics: temperature anomalies, equipment malfunctions, and the presence of figures that looked like people but weren't quite right. I started consulting on these cases, charging reasonable fees to help business owners develop their own sets of protective protocols. The work was familiar: identifying supernatural hotspots, establishing containment measures, training staff to recognize and respond to breakthrough events. I was becoming the go-to expert on paranormal workplace safety in rural Texas. But the real breakthrough came when I realized I wasn't working alone. Late one night in April, while helping the owners of a haunted truck wash establish a safe operating procedure for their automated systems, I caught sight of a familiar figure in my peripheral vision. Miguel Santos stood beside one of the wash bays, no longer bearing the hollow terror I'd seen in his eyes at the cafeteria. Instead, he looked peaceful, complete. When I turned to look at him directly, he raised one hand in a gesture that could have been a wave or a blessing, then faded from view like smoke dissipating in the wind. Over the following weeks, I began to understand that the previous cook and the others who had been trapped beneath the cafeteria weren't malevolent presences anymore. They were helpers, guides who appeared at the sites where fragments of the original entity had taken root. They were using their knowledge of supernatural containment to assist with the cleanup of the mess I'd inadvertently created. Miguel appeared most often, usually when I was struggling with a particularly difficult case. He never spoke, but his presence was reassuring rather than terrifying. Sometimes he would point toward areas that needed special attention or gesture in ways that suggested specific containment measures. The other former prisoners appeared less frequently, but served similar functions. Thomas's predecessor, a woman named Catherine who died in 1987, specialized in electrical system anomalies. A night janitor named Robert helped with cases involving contaminated cleaning supplies. Each spirit brought expertise from their time, maintaining the protocols at the original site. By summer, we'd established a loose network of protected locations throughout the region. Not perfect containment. That was probably impossible, but manageable coexistence between the supernatural fragments and the people who had to work around them. Each side had its own set of rules, its own protective measures, its own trained staff who understood the importance of following protocols exactly. I'd accidentally created a supernatural ecosystem, but with help from the very people who'd been victimized by the original infestation, we were learning to maintain a balance between the worlds of the living and the dead. The work paid well enough to keep me comfortable, and more importantly, it felt like redemption for the choices I made that February night. I couldn't undo the damage I'd caused by destroying the cafeteria's containment systems, but I could take responsibility for cleaning up the consequences. And sometimes, late at night when I was alone in some haunted truck stop or isolated diner, I could swear I heard Miguel's voice carried on the Texas wind, no longer screaming in terror, but laughing with the pure joy of someone who'd finally found peace. The rules had changed, but they still existed. They'd simply evolved to meet new circumstances, adapted to handle dozens of smaller threats instead of one overwhelming presence. And I'd learned that some jobs aren't just about earning money or even about survival. Sometimes they're about accepting responsibility for the unintended consequences of the choices we make when we're backed into corners. The Lone Star family cafeteria was gone, reduced to rubble and memories and cautionary tales shared among the night shift workers of rural Texas. But its legacy lived on in the network of protected sites we'd established, in the protocols we developed, and in the understanding that sometimes the best way to contain something dangerous is to scatter it so widely that no single location can accumulate enough power to become truly threatening. Miguel had been right that night in the basement. The rules were breaking down, but new rules had taken their place. And those of us who'd learned the hard way about the spaces between life and death were there to teach them to anyone willing to listen. After all, there's always another night shift, and there's always someone who needs to know how to survive until morning. The Texas wind carries many voices, and if you know how to listen, you can learn to distinguish between the ones trying to help and the ones trying to lead you astray. It's just another rule to learn, another protocol to master. And I've gotten very good at learning rules, even the ones written in blood and whispered by the dead.